Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Cindy Russell, co-chair of the Santa Clara County Medical Association's Environmental Health Committee. We welcome you to tonight's presentation with Dr. Desiree LaBeaud, who will discuss microplastics and our health. Thank you so much for joining us. This webinar is the third in our four-part Environment and Health webinar series 2026, and our last webinar will be next week on Tuesday, May 5th at 6 p.m., featuring former EPA scientist and environmental health expert Dr. Tracy Woodruff from Stanford, and Dr. Nick Chartres, professor at the University of Sydney in Australia, discussing corporate determinants of health, industry influence in science, and the UCSF Internal Industry Document Library. So you can sign up for this free webinar by going to the SCCMA.org website and then to news and events and then upcoming events. And we will also put this in the chat box. Note that this program will be recorded and posted on the SCCMA.org website on the Environmental Health webpage for viewing later. And you can also view prior webinars on a whole variety of topics on environmental health as well. Now, a little bit about the SCCMA. The Santa Clara County Medical Association is a professional organization representing more than 4,700 physicians across all specialties, practice settings, and stages of their careers. Their mission is to support physicians in delivering the highest quality care to their patients. The SCCMA works through advocacy, education, and community engagement with local, state, and national partners to promote the practice of medicine, advance public health, and protect the well-being of both physicians and patients. Today's webinar is part of the SCCMA's ongoing commitment to provide timely, relevant, and practical information to the medical community, as well as to foster collaboration and knowledge sharing across the healthcare ecosystem. It's a wonderful organization. I'm very proud to be part of it. A couple of other items to note. You will be muted during the entire program, but we invite you to post questions anytime in the Q&A box. We will not have live audio questions. We will take questions for the speakers at the end of the program. We will also try to post resources during the program in the chat box for you to copy, but if not, we will make every effort to make these available on the website linked to the recorded video. I'm honored now to introduce Dr. Desiree LaBeaud. She's a physician scientist, epidemiologist, and professor in the Division of Pediatric Infectious Disease at Stanford's University School of Medicine. She's also an associate dean of Stanford Center for Innovation and Global Health. Dr. LaBeaud is a senior fellow at the Woods Institute and co-director of the Stanford Climate Learning Initiative in Medical Education. She studies the epidemiology and ecology of domestic and international arboviruses and emerging infections, with an interest in the vector-host relationship as well as environmental factors that affect transmission dynamics and spectrum of disease. Her research is community engaged and seeks to define and then disrupt the underlying structural determinants of health. She received her MD at the Medical College of Wisconsin and trained at the Rainbow Babies and Children's Hospital during her pediatric residency and pediatric infectious disease fellowship program. She earned her master's degree in clinical research and epidemiology at Case Western Reserve University. Dr. LaBeaud also studies the human health impacts of climate change, including research focused on innovative solutions to the global plastic pollution crisis. She's worked in Kenya, Grenada, Ecuador, Pakistan, and Brazil. She currently heads a clinical research lab focused on better understanding the risk factors and long-term health consequences of arboviral infections and the most effective means of prevention. Dr. LaBeaud launched a nonprofit, the Health and Environmental Research Institute, Kenya, which is an initiative focused on Kenya to inspire community education, new research, policy change, and grassroots activism in environmental health issues. She also founded the Plastic Health Working Group, which is part of Stanford Center for Human and Planetary Health. It's a vibrant and multidisciplinary group that meets monthly and aims to identify knowledge gaps and develop evidence-based and nature-based solutions to mitigate the health impacts of plastic pollution locally at Stanford, across California, and on a global scale. I know you'll enjoy this talk. I've heard it once. Thank you so much, Dr. LaBeaud, for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. Welcome, everyone. Good evening. Tonight I'm here to talk to you about plastics and health. And I'm hoping that by the end of this, you're not going to be depressed. You're going to be inspired to take action and change maybe some of your medical practice or join some local groups to really get active in this area. So I'm going to briefly depress you by going over the plastic crisis, and then I'll talk about some macro plastic impacts on health and microplastic impacts on health. And then we'll talk about some solutions and the power of partnerships and people and some policy updates, particularly related to California. So the learning objectives are to first understand the human and planetary health impacts of plastic pollution. And then because I'm a pediatrician, I want to spend just a little bit of time examining the unique risks to children's health. And then we'll explore some nature-based solutions and talk a little bit about policy and partnerships. So as all of you on this call know, the plastic crisis is getting worse and more plastic is being produced every year in our world. The thoughts are that we make about 400 million tons of plastic each year, and that's supposed to double by 2040 and triple by 2050. We've already accumulated about 9 billion tons of plastic on the planet, and unfortunately, about 40% of that is single-use plastics, maybe plastics that never even needed to be out in the world. And I run into this all the time. So this was a picture I took actually in the Heathrow Airport, in the children's area where they, have these two trash cans and the happy recycling trash can and then the very sad landfill trash can. Well, this of course is actually a lie because we know that most of the plastic, less than 20% of it is actually designed to be recyclable, and most of it ends up in the black trash can. We know that there's 9 billion tons, more than a ton for every person on Earth, and that there's more than 1 million plastic water bottles sold every minute. That for every person on the planet, there's 21,000 pieces of plastic floating in the ocean. And this is what some of that looks like. This is one of the Great Pacific garbage patches. This is a place where it's like the soupy plastic part, but in some parts of the garbage patch, it just looks like normal ocean. It's just that there's so many microplastics that have come there because of the currents in the ocean. We know that unfortunately each year 14 million tons of plastic waste escapes into the ocean and 11 million tons sits on the ocean floor. And studies have now suggested that about 40% of the ocean surface is covered in plastic. And that is just difficult to imagine, right? Again, there's so much microplastic, you can't always see it, but it is there. And unfortunately, plastic is getting everywhere, even the far reaches of the planet, like the Arctic Ocean and the Arctic snow, where we can still find plastic. And it's coming from households and traffic and agriculture and, dumping, industry, shipyards, tourism, fisheries, and so forth. And it's really getting moved around the world in the atmosphere, through rivers and ocean currents, and then sea ice and permafrost eroding. And I like to remind people that this is a relatively new problem. Plastics were not common in the world and in America, and really until the mid 50s or so. And part of this is that, it's plastic is, of course, an oil and gas product. And American companies pump 13 million barrels of oil each day on average, making us the largest crude oil producer in the world with huge subsidies, $14 billion in 2022. And the oil and gas industry is expected to continue to reap billions of dollars in tax breaks over the next few years. We all know that there's more and more electric vehicles hitting the streets, and so there's less demand for gasoline. And so more and more oil is being transitioned into plastic. And we in the US generate more plastic waste per capita than any country in the world, now nearly 40 million tons. And, where is this happening? Like what are the different ways that plastic is flooding our world? Well, you can see here in blue, a lot of it is packaging, but there's also a lot of textiles, consumer products, and so forth. In 2019 alone, there was 1.8 billion tons of greenhouse gases generated by plastics production, and we've had 22 million tons of macroplastic entering, the oceans and the land, and another 5 million tons as microplastic. We also know that when you say plastic, it's not just the polymer we're talking about, but it's all the chemicals that are put into that polymer to give it its amazing properties. And so we know that there are about 16,000 chemicals in plastic, and unfortunately, we only know what some of them do. And we know that 25% of them are classified as hazardous, but the great majority, 66% of them, haven't yet been assessed for safety. We also know that we're continually eating plastic in our daily lives, about a credit card a week. And a recent study found that, there's enough plastic in our brains to be equivalent to about a plastic spoon. And this study, there was a rebuttal in The Guardian about maybe the measurements here, but I'll just show you that looking at the measurements done in 2016 and done in 2024, even if there is, an element of error in those measurements, it's still getting worse. There's more plastic in our livers, more plastic in our kidneys, more plastic in our brains. And of course, a lot of us on this call, we are in healthcare, and we know that so much plastic comes out of healthcare, more than 1.7 million tons per year generated by the US healthcare industry alone. And this just keeps going up, up, and up. So there are a lot of impacts of plastic on health. Of course, there's impacts on food security because plastic literally chokes the marine food chains and threatens both biodiversity and protein sources for many people in the world. As I mentioned, there's toxic pollutants in the plastic itself, but then also as plastic floats around in the oceans and breaks into smaller and finer particles, there are hydrophobic pollutants that then attach to the plastics in the water, and those get ingested by us when we eat our plastic. Many parts of the world, plastic is actually burned because waste management is not optimized in many places. And so in sub-Saharan Africa, 75% of waste is burned. And so plastic being burned releases a lot of chemical substances that I'll talk about. And of course, this is contributing to the 9 million people who die each year from air pollution. And then finally, the way I got into plastic actually is through macroplastics, because it turns out that macroplastics just sitting around on the land can actually collect water and provide breeding grounds for mosquitoes, and also rodent breeding grounds. And so this is connected to infectious diseases, and I'm an infectious disease physician. Usually in my practice in the clinics, I end up spending a lot of time dealing with organisms that are attached to plastic lines in patients, right? IV catheter infections and so forth. And so we all know that plastic provides a great breeding grounds for pathogens. And it's possible now, as we are creating this plastosphere on our planet, that plastic pollution may drive the emergence and dissemination of new diseases, organisms and pathogens that maybe have new resistance mechanisms that then can be spread on this physical space, which is the plastosphere. And we know that, as I mentioned in the Arctic picture, our rain contains plastic, our snow contains plastic. In our lab, we just are completing a project with indigenous tribes across the US and finding rain and snow full of microplastics. And we know that as the atmosphere drops these microplastics, it ends up in the soil, and the soil then is covered with all these microplastics. And when you grow plants and crops in that soil, the plants actually uptake the microplastics. And then the microplastics are in the crops that then we and other animals eat. Also, terrifyingly, I found out there was a paper published last year that microplastics in plants can actually prevent photosynthesis. And of course, photosynthesis is the foundation of all life on our planet. So this is a very harrowing fact. And there's more and more microplastic disturbance and contamination of soil across the world. Now, I'm using the term microplastic, and size really matters here. So, as plastic is out in the world, it just breaks down into finer and finer particles. We call microplastics anything less than 5 micrometers and, millimeters. And as microplastics break down, they can break down into tiny fragments that we call nanoplastics, which you can see here are in the nanometer range. And so the issue here is that depending, we're ingesting these microplastics and nanoplastics, we're also inhaling them. And the smaller the plastic particle, the deeper in our body it can get. And these nanoplastics are able to cross the alveoli and get into our circulatory system and cause a lot of problems. So we're ingesting these microplastics, we're eating them. We can also get exposed to them when they're on their skin, and there's all different sizes, and there's different polymer types, and there's different shapes and charges of these plastics, and they contain different contaminants or plasticizers in them that can have impacts on our body. And so then they deposit in different parts of our body, and then we have to try to measure them. And measuring them is a very difficult thing. There's no real standards yet of how best to measure these microplastics and what are thresholds for health. None of that exists yet, as this is a fairly new part of science. But there are all these different ways to measure microplastics. And as you can see, a lot of these ways are really big sort of equipments. And of course, with that, they're expensive. You need specialized people to actually run the machine. And it can be very difficult to compare microplastic measurements across these different devices. But at least what we know so far is that whenever anyone has looked at any parts of our bodies, they've generally been able to detect microplastics. They've been found everywhere, all different types, different colors, different polymers, and so forth. And they've also been detected in all our secretions and excretions: saliva, breast milk, semen, stool, sputum, and urine. And it turns out that, plastic is pretty much omnipresent in our organ systems. In our brain, microplastics have been found and associated with neurologic conditions. We found it in lung tissue and blood, in skin and associations with skin inflammation. And in a study, a recent study, they found microplastics in 100% of placental samples. And so really our babies are actually being pre-polluted because we've now found microplastics in the placenta itself, in the fetal tissues, and in even baby's first poop, meconium, before the babies even come out and eaten. So this, of course, is going to have impacts on human health. When we look at the cellular level, there was this study by Ali in the Lancet that just summarized the results of microplastic and nanoplastic health impacts. And this study showed that plastics can lead to oxidative stress, inflammation, immune dysfunction, altered biochemical and energy metabolism, impaired cell proliferation, disrupted microbial metabolic pathways, abnormal organ development, and carcinogenesis. Pretty much everything that you don't want to happen in your cells, this has been associated with micro and nanoplastic exposure. And so depending on your favorite organ system and what you do, you're going to see different impacts on that organ system and what the associations are with plastics, and disease in that system. And most of the data, because plastics are so ubiquitous, most of the data really is associative. We have all these plastics, we find them in all these organs. We also know that there's all these associations with disease, but there hasn't been a lot of causal data. It's so difficult to do because everyone's really exposed to plastic. But there is more and more data now coming out that really seems like it's just more causal in nature. And this is just one study that I wanted to review with you on microplastics and cardiovascular health. So in this study, there were about 300 people coming in for cardiac endarterectomy. So they're coming in, they had a blockage, they were going to come get it taken out in the cath lab. And so what the authors of the study did was they scooped out that plaque and then measured to see if it had microplastics in it. And then followed the 300 individuals over 3 years for 3 end events, either death, stroke, or heart attack. And so what they found, of course, was that the microplastics that were present in the atheromas were contributing to inflammation and oxidative stress and cardiovascular disease. And they took out the plaques from carotid arteries and aortas and coronary arteries, and they found all these different sorts of plastics. These are very common plastics in our life: PET and PVC and PE, polyethylene. And they did electron microscopy, and you can see these little kind of sharp pieces of microplastic actually in the plaques, right? You can imagine that could be quite inflammatory. And then they followed these patients over 3 years. And those patients who had microplastics in their plaque, they were 4.5 times more likely to die, have a heart attack, or have a stroke than those who didn't have microplastics in their plaque. And so, I think that's very important data. Of course, we know that these microplastics are having an impact on inflammation and reproductive health. Again, we know that they contribute to chronic inflammation, potentially infertility, complications during pregnancy. And then there's all the things in the plastic, like BPA, that can then act as endocrine disruptors. And we know, again, that there's just widespread exposure, right? And so for a developing fetus, you can imagine that it's being exposed to a lot of different microplastics, and that it's possible that these microplastics might actually be already entering that fetal environment and causing problems. And children are particularly vulnerable to plastic harms. As they grow up, children breathe and eat more per unit of body weight than adults, so they might have higher exposure than plastics. Their whole world is covered in plastic. Children absorb a lot more pollutants relative to their body size and are less able to eliminate them from their bodies. And then, of course, in the case of the fetus and even just young children, their organs are developing and growing. And so if plastics are going to have problems, if plastics are going to cause problems with organogenesis or, problems with DNA repair and all of this, you can imagine that this is going to have a big problem in a developing child. It's true that children are exposed in the placenta, they're exposed through breast milk, and then all the other exposure routes, right? And really, it's everywhere, right? From the minute they come out and they're being examined by their pediatrician, right, to all the diapers, their bottles with their milk, all the toys, the playgrounds, the school building materials, everything is plastic. And studies have documented that associations of many different problems in birth and infancy and childhood and later childhood with plastics. All the things that we're really worried about now, a lot of allergic diseases, atopic diseases, asthma, obesity, even ADHD and so forth, have been associated with plastic in different studies. And if you're particularly interested in this, there's a great report by UNICEF called Generation Plastic that really details a lot of this work. So what can we do, right? Many of us might be parents out there. I'm a pediatrician. We care a lot about our children. We can discourage waste burning, of course, because, it's one thing to be ingesting the plastic, but also to be inhaling it, and all those dioxins and other toxic chemicals can be very harmful. We can do our best to reduce plastic use, limit canned foods and drinks and ultra-processed foods in our children's diet. Utilize safe food storage practices using glass and not plastic, and avoid heating, microwaving, or freezing plastic. Trying to choose non-plastic toys and baby products, and trying to avoid plastic in cosmetics and using natural fiber clothing. Again, we inhale a lot of plastic that comes from household dust, so vacuuming or purifying the air in the home if possible, ensuring proper ventilation, and then just knowing what you're putting in front of your children, right? Really checking product safety, and of course, washing their hands before they eat, so any microplastics on their hands don't get into their mouths when they're eating. But again, UNICEF is a great source for these particularly children and plastics. I also like to bring up that plastic pollution is really an equity issue. So the adverse effects of plastic and plastic pollution on human health are not evenly distributed, and we know that disproportionately that the harms actually disproportionately affect poor, disempowered, and marginalized communities, especially fence-line communities. The most disadvantaged are the most vulnerable. So globally, there's over about 20 million adult and child waste pickers. Those are children that are in the informal plastic recycling trade in different countries of the world, including children as young as 5 years of age and a lot of pregnant women. Studies show that, some of these fence line communities, families that are living near fossil fuel extraction sites, experience higher rates of cancer. And we know that plastic waste predominantly flows from higher income regions that can manage their waste to poorer income regions that cannot. And so if you're interested in that, there's a paper that we published just all about the ethics of plastic waste and how plastic flows across the world from rich to poor. So those who benefit economically from plastic, oil and gas companies, should really bear their fair share of the currently externalized costs. As far as plastic burning goes, I mentioned that dioxins are released, that they can cause cancer. Everybody knows about PFAS, the forever chemical that accumulates in the bodies of every living organism on Earth and can lead to endocrine disruption and immune system suppression. And then there's benzene and VOCs, volatile organic compounds that are linked to lung disease and cancer. Also important to note that plastic gets burned because of, non-optimal waste management practices in parts of the world, but also a lot of plastic is burning as wildfires become more and more common. And of course, that causes a lot of risk because wildfire smoke is 10 times more harmful to human health than even regular smoke. So as far as PFAS goes, this is a map of PFAS around the whole world. Pretty much wherever they've looked, they found PFAS. Don't think that Africa and Latin America are spared. It's just that there have been fewer studies there. But wherever, wherever they've looked, PFAS has been found, right? It's this chemical that's put in plastic to make it water repellent, but it accumulates and causes endocrine disruption and cancer and reproductive harm. And it's been found in water, soil, food, in humans. And now recent studies show that more than two-thirds of marine mammals have microplastics and PFAS in their bodies, right? Which then, of course, these things also then pass to us. And there's a whole, trophic food chain in the food web of the ocean where more and more, the small organisms are the bottom feeders are getting more and more plastic. Things eat those, and it just keeps compounding and accumulating to the tuna that we're eating and all of that. And so we're just seeing more and more plastic in our diets. And there's just a bazillion people publishing about this. So this is just the exponential rise in plastic and health publications over the years. So it's very hard to keep up with all of this data. But there's a lot more research that actually needs to be done in this space. So we need to continue to investigate the biological effects of plastic, focusing on inflammation and endocrine disruption. We need, as I mentioned, standardized methods for really defining microplastics in specimens, how we measure them, and then what are the thresholds for health, if any. Um, we have to expand research beyond the most common plastics just to examine other microplastics and their associated chemicals and figure out the exposure pathways, how we're getting exposed to them, and how we can improve elimination of plastics in our bodies. We need to evaluate long-term exposure risks, the environmental pathways of how plastics are entering the food chain, air and water systems, what it's doing to our gut microbiome and metabolism, how it's accumulating again and how to get rid of it. Focus on the impacts of microplastics on children's health and the really at-risk groups to protect these folks. Again, better tools for monitoring microplastics in solid, liquid, and air forms, investigate the psychological impacts of microplastic exposure, and then do more to really push policy to protect us from this health harm. I also mentioned biodegradable materials. So, there's a lot of talk about, those non-plastic compostable bags that we're all using and PLA, polylactic acid, and if that's good for our health. More and more evidence is showing that it's probably not very good for our health. So it'd be great to go back to alternatives that we used to use, like paper and hemp and foil, things that we know don't harm our health. We have a lot of these things. And so we might need to be able to give up a little bit of our convenience for health. And we can maybe talk about that in the question time. And then I'll mention there are some organisms that can actually degrade plastics. And so maybe there could be something there too. We need to really put the cap on plastic production. But for all the plastic that already exists on our tiny planet, we're going to have to do something with it. So maybe we can find ways to use nature-based solutions to actually degrade it. I just want to talk very briefly about some of our work. So I said that we came to the plastic crisis because I worked on mosquito-borne viruses and I was trying to figure out why kids in Kenya were getting ill from, we found all these mosquito viruses that were spreading and making them ill, like dengue and chikungunya. And then so we needed to look for the vectors so that we could prevent these diseases. And all the vectors were breeding in the man-made plastic containers around our homesteads. And so in many parts of Kenya and many other countries of the world, solid waste is poorly managed. And we know that there are more and more people in the world, and each one of them is using more and more plastic. We know plastics don't biodegrade. We know a lot of the waste remains uncollected. Less than 10% of plastic is recycled worldwide. And our research actually showed all this plastic laying around to be great breeding grounds for Aedes aegypti mosquitoes, which spread dengue, yellow fevers, chikungunya, and Zika. And so what we found in our studies in vector ecology is just that the plastic trash laying around bred the most of these mosquitoes, and that was really close to human homesteads where people are living. And so it contributes to more than 50% of our community actually being exposed to these viruses. But I'm an opportunist, and so if all this plastic trash laying around is causing disease, if we clean it up, then we could probably reduce disease. And there was not a lot of recycling or reduction happening in Kenya. And so there was a big opportunity to really do trash collection and create jobs and livelihoods. And so again, this plastic waste acts as breeding grounds. And, more plastic waste, more mosquito breeding, which leads to higher rates of disease transmission, right? So improving that could really help us. And so we wanted to create a circular economy of waste. Instead of this linear extractive economy, right? Oil and gas, just take it, make a product, and let it just go to waste. We really wanted to create the circular economy and sort of allow folks who were underemployed in our areas to actually benefit from really recycling and reusing this waste. So the first thing we did was we were doing a huge intervention, educational intervention in the schools and communities, and recognized that all of this plastic waste was causing a lot of disease. And so we did a huge cleanup campaign where 250 school kids from 5 primary schools picked up more than 17,000 containers of waste, more than a ton of plastic waste. And we try to repurpose as much of that waste by planting native tree seedlings, about 4,000 of them. And so we see them now when I visit the homesteads and the schoolyards of these kids. But we were left with a ton of plastic waste that we could either bury or burn. And so we buried it, but no one ever feels good about that. So we knew we needed to do more. And so we had a trash to treasure program where we were collecting trash for profit to reduce vector breeding sites and working with men that were in the informal plastic recycling trade in Kenya and tried to improve their business management skills and their relationships with key stakeholders, and also provided them with training so that they're doing that work in the informal plastic recycling trade to send their kids to school and to earn ends meet, but actually they're doing a great service to their community if they can do it safely and not breed mosquitoes while they're doing it. And so this project led to more plastic being traded, which means more plastic off the streets and out of our communities. Better business for the yard shop operators, a stronger peer network, and significant reductions in Aedes aegypti breeding, which was great. But we recognized there was a lot more to be done. We needed to create more community awareness and decrease stigma, improve waste infrastructure, create a market for second-use products, and work with our policymakers to explore policies and enforce policies in the recycling and environmental sustainability realm to really cultivate this recycling culture. And in order to do that work, almost 5 years ago now, we launched a nonprofit called the Health and Environmental Research Institute, or HARI for short, which means blessings in Swahili. And this is an initiative that really inspires collective action towards healthier communities and more sustainable environments. And so we do a lot of education and community outreach, destigmatize trash collection, strengthening relationships, create jobs, and then in the end, try to decrease mosquito and trash related health risks and improve the trajectories of health for our communities and our planet. One of the first things we did in plastic was we needed to build a lot of awareness in the community about the health harms of plastic. And so I got a grant through Stanford called the Denning Visiting Artist Fund to work with Brooklyn-based artist Jean Shin, who's a famous artist who works in discards. And so we, together with 50 community members and many students in art and environment, in engineering and all sorts of students. We got together in Kenya in the middle of town where we're working in Diani, which is on the south coast on the Indian Ocean coast. And we created this sculpture called Seed Change out of 8,000 single-use plastic water bottles. And it was in the center of town, really sparked a lot of dialogue around the plastic pollution crisis, the impacts on the ocean, the impacts on us, and also just the underlying inequity of not having safe, reliable access to clean water. We still live in a world where 25% of the population, 2 billion people, do not have safe, reliable access to clean water. And so we did that sculpture, and then Jean also came to Stanford, and we did the same thing using single-use plastic from the research side. So this is some of my lab's single-use plastic waste, along with other labs that are in the Biomedical Innovation Building where I am at Stanford. And again, in medicine and healthcare, we're creating and generating so much single-use plastic, right? So again, we wanted to draw attention to the pollution crisis, our choices and our power in it, and really encourage labs to both conduct waste audits and identify their usage patterns and opportunities to green up their labs. And so we created these toolkits on waste audits and greening that are still available today. I mentioned that there are some organisms that naturally can degrade plastic, which is kind of fun to think about. There's this organism called Idenella sakiensis, which was found in the trash dumps of Japan in like 2016. It's a bacterium that can chew up plastic, but it takes a while. And then there's fungi that can do it, mushrooms, and then there's also mealworms, right? And black soldier flies, also here, Hermetia, are also organisms that might be able to do this. And so, with our nonprofit in Kenya, we've been working in this waste crisis, and we work in plastic pollution, but we also work in compostable waste. And we recognized that there was an opportunity for all the compostable waste to create a circular economy of waste by using the black soldier fly. Again, the waste is laying around, breeding mosquitoes, breeding rodents, causing a lot of disease and problems. And you can actually give it a purpose, have these black soldier fly larvae feed on it. And then what they give you is they chew up all the waste and you end up with two really valuable products. Their feces, which is actually a nutrient-rich fertilizer for crops, and their bodies, which is the perfect protein component for livestock and chicken feed. So you take waste and then you create fertilizer and food out of it. And we also have some ideas about, using our black soldier fly farm that exists in Kenya to actually also have these organisms try to chew up plastic and measure plastic in all of the outputs and make sure that they're actually biologically degrading the plastic. So this is just an example, the black soldier fly farm, again, of a circular economy of waste. And in this case, because there were no women in the waste trade in Kenya, we actually made the farm women run and women led and brought women to the waste sector, which is doing a lot for women empowerment in Kenya. And really our long-term vision, a world where plastic pollution is drastically reduced or eliminated and communities are empowered to safeguard their health and environment. And I can promise you that women working together, linked, informed, and educated, can bring peace and prosperity to this forsaken planet. Partnerships are super critical for this work. I care a lot about equitable partnership, everything I've been talking about, all the research and everything that's actually happening in plastic. Partnerships are so critical. And so if you're interested in partnership, we actually spent 5 years creating a book on partnership, which is free and open access. It's just at that QR code there. This was written by 90 authors from 26 countries, bringing a lot of diverse perspectives to partnership. And I think it's highly valuable. I'm teaching a class at Stanford on this right now. Partnerships are just critical for human life. So I highly recommend digging in here. The book is separated into foundations and case studies and future visions, a lot of reflection and dreaming about a better future for all. So what can physicians do when we talk specifically about the plastic pollution crisis? Well, recognize that the low cost and convenience of plastics is really deceptive. They actually have a lot of harms and environmental health risks. And, those aren't calculated and put into life cycle assessments when you're thinking about, it's so much cheaper to move this product from here to there when you use plastic because it's lighter than glass, let's say. Well, that may be for that bit, but for the whole life cycle, what is it doing to human health and to the environment? We really have to take a more expansive view. I think it's important to encourage patients to reduce their use of plastics, particularly unnecessary single-use items, and educate them on safe alternatives. Inventory your use and your institution's use of plastics and try to figure out areas that you might be able to reduce or green up and replace with greener alternatives. Implement necessary changes to green up your operations, your operating rooms, your labs, right? And then advocate for stronger policies that promote sustainable healthcare practices and reduce our dependence on plastic. And continue to talk to your patients about the health risks associated with plastic exposure and involve them in the efforts. When we wrote this paper about the US and plastic waste disposal in our US healthcare systems, there's really a lot of ways that we can transform the healthcare waste stream, right? Through our operations, through really working with our policymakers and promoting policies, and then also through partnership. And I would just say start where you are. If you're like me and you have a lab, green up your lab. If you're working in the clinic, think about greening up your clinic. There's a lot of resources out there. I also do a lot of field work. Now more and more research the funders of the field work are requiring that you actually measure your environmental sustainability footprint. Of course, not here in the US, but in Europe, which is, leaps and bounds ahead of us when it comes to environmental sustainability. They're starting to require that. And then think about it, changes start at home, right? You can do things at your home, make your environment at home safer for you and your family. I led the ASTMH, which is the American Society of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene Green Task Force, where we were trying to green up, the lab work and the clinical work and the field work that was happening in tropical medicine research. And so there's also a lot of resources online for that work through the ASTMH Green Task Force. Um, Also, depending on what specialty you are, there may be opportunities to join with other people in your specialty and really come together and think about how you might together be able to lean on each other and really move the specialty towards greener practices. As I mentioned, I'm an infectious disease physician, and there's a group called Sustainable ID, which meets monthly. And there's a lot of education around how to green up, but also some practical advice and toolkits and just a community of practice to help us all just take the steps we need to take to decrease plastic in our clinics and in our ID practice. And for ID, this isn't just the PPE we wear, the single-use plastics, but even diagnostic stewardship, antibiotic stewardship, right? Switching patients from IV to PO as soon as you can. That actually saves a lot of waste, right? Only ordering the diagnostics or the tests that you need, right? So there are so many ways that can really help us both decrease plastic and single-use plastic within our health care really practice, but also decrease greenhouse gas emissions overall. If you're interested in this and you care a lot about plastic and health, I co-lead a plastic working group at Stanford with Amelia Myers, pictured there on the left. And this is just a group that comes together from all different walks of life. There are physicians, there are people who run labs, there's engineers, there's students, there's policymakers, there's indigenous tribes, there's industry, social scientists. I mean, so many different people from within Stanford and outside of Stanford who are really interested in plastics and trying to drive, more research and more innovations and interventions and policy and community for plastics. So that's a link to our plastics working group. If you're interested, we meet monthly. We meet the first Thursday from 3 to 4:30 p.m. Of every month. So we live on a tiny little planet, right? And actually, plastic, as I showed you, moves around in our atmosphere and our air currents and our ocean currents, and plastic over here becomes plastic over there, right? So really what we need is a global plastic treaty, right? That really includes protection of human health and the environment and can address the supply of plastic products and chemicals, and make it really easy to understand what our plastic products are made of and what chemicals are in our plastic products and what those chemicals and plastic polymers do to us, right? Emissions and releases, and also the waste management, including extended producer responsibility. So there's a lot of support that's needed for a big global treaty in plastic, really to put a cap on plastic production with legally binding limits to reduce single-use plastics that don't need to be used and phase out the ones that we already know are very harmful to ecosystems and human health. And then to really put some brakes on what's allowed in plastic, which is coming into contact with all of our babies and all the living things on the planet, and really not allow hazardous chemicals in those. Now, unfortunately, in 2024, the UN Plastic Treaty did not reach an agreement. And so it's currently stalled, but work is still happening in subcommittees. And if you're really interested in the UN Plastic Treaty, the speaker who will be at our next plastics working group meeting, which is next Thursday on May 4th or 5th, that Thursday next week, is Margaret Spring, who goes to the UN Plastic Treaty meetings and is actually going to give us a policy update both on the UN Plastic Treaty and also California plastics regulations, including SB 54 and others. But really what we're trying to do here is really reduce toxicity, right? Cap production, eliminate single-use plastics, phase out the toxins, ban intentionally added microplastics to to cosmetics require full transparency, and then really focus on disposal and recycling of plastics. Why create something that can't be disposed safely on our planet? And then prevent incineration, which really perpetuates toxicities. So I just wanted to bring up in the last minute here, California is an amazing place. We are really one of the leaders in sort of plastic policy. And we often are like a role model for the rest of the US and in some cases other parts of the world. So we had a microbead ban that spread across many states back about 10 years ago. We have a microplastic strategy trying to ban certain plastics in foodware. Um, Microplastics in drinking water. The state water board is actually thinking about establishing specific thresholds, calling microplastics a chemical of concern and treating it that way so that it's actually measured and reported and then dealt with. There are microplastic filters that are going to be mandated, extended producer responsibility, which is the SB 54, which is a huge, huge California bill that's requiring plastic producers to really join a state-approved recycling program and meet key targets like reduction of single-use plastic packaging, 100% recyclable or compostable packaging, more and more recycling, and then industry funding. So actually, the industries that are creating all this plastic and single-use plastic in the world have them pay for the cleanup and the pollution mitigation. There's also the big lawsuit against ExxonMobil. That was, it continues to move forward. This is a bill that, or excuse me, it's a lawsuit. It's four different nonprofits that came together to sue Exxon for lying to us about the fact that plastic is not really recyclable. And so that is moving forward. It went through one court and continues to progress. And then there's a DEHP ban. So DEHP is this plasticizer that's actually put in IV tubing. It turns out it causes cancer. And so California is requiring that it come out of IV tubing, right? And so these are just some of the policies that are happening in California, but it's going to take a lot, right, to end plastic pollution. I mean, we need to definitely, again, decrease the amount of plastic being made, figure out how to, actually safely dispose of all the plastic we have, and then just eliminate the avoidable, right? And in time, reduce the size of the problem. Personal actions matter, right? So for you tonight, try to do your best to avoid single-use plastics, replace the plastics in your lives if you can. The clothing, textiles is actually really important. Every time we wash our clothes, millions and billions of microplastics come off of them and go into our water supply, right? If you have a lot of polyester clothes and stuff, so choose natural fiber clothing. The indigenous, we have the leader of the natural fiber program, the Indigenous Natural Fiber Program, as part of our working group. And so it really does matter. We can think and use natural alternatives to plastic. Again, a lot of the things I mentioned, filters, filtering your air, really supporting policies that advocate for stronger regulations, and then cleaning up, right? We still have a lot of plastic to clean up so it doesn't leak into our oceans and leak into our soil. And so we can do that as well. So to conclude, the global plastic crisis harms health, the environment, and ecosystems. Microplastics and toxins from plastic pollution have been linked to inflammation, cardiovascular disease, and organ damage, posing serious long-term health threats. Children are particularly high risk for health harms. Their organs are developing. So this is a big deal. And their whole lives are full of plastic. And so we need to think about that and do something different. More research is needed to fully understand the impacts of macroplastics and microplastics on health. However, we already know enough that it's probably not good. They have a lot of harmful chemicals in them. They're breaking down. They're coming into our bodies. We probably know enough that we should be avoiding plastics and preventing the health harms that we already know exist. So efforts at all scales are really needed to solve this crisis, from local action, like I mentioned with our nonprofit in Kenya, here in Kenya, to global action with the UN Plastics Treaty. It's really going to take all of us at all the levels fighting this. So I like to say climate change is both our greatest health threat and our greatest opportunity. Like solutions to climate change, resolution of the plastic crisis is going to require a wide scale transition away from fossil carbon, and inaction is no longer an option. And I thank you very much for your attention. I'll take any questions.
Wow. Thank you, Dr. LaBeaud. Amazing. That was a wonderful talk, and thank you so much for the presentation. It's a really profoundly critical topic. It affects the well-being of the entire planet, and it's such an insidious pollutant. We've people talked for years about chemicals and pesticides, which are all bad, industrial chemicals, but this is a new one that people had no idea, that was all part of us now. So thank you for your outreach and all your work on this. I think you have convinced all of us on this talk here that a healthy future depends upon reducing plastics.
Yeah,
So, and
thank
I'm
you.
sure this not only educates us, but it moves policy forward. So your work is really critical. So we're going to go ahead and take questions now. We
And
have,
saying that, Emily is putting so many amazing resources in the
yeah.
chat. I'll just
So
start by saying I see that first resource. Yeah, so the issue is now there's all these compostable plastic bags, which we thought we were supposed to feel better about because they were compostable. And we know plastic is bad and doesn't, isn't really recyclable, all of this. And now more and more evidence is just showing that these compostable plastic bags also never break down. And they might be even worse than the regular plastic. And it's true. And more work needs to be done with that. But it's one of those things like we could just go back to paper bags and, I just, a lot, there's, foil, glass, hemp. I mean, we have some solutions already, right? And we need to be using them more and demanding them as consumers. As part of our working group, we have the environmental working group, the EWG, that comes to our meetings, and they're amazing, right? For a consumer resource, you can go on there and you can see like, is this
right.
bad for the planet? Is this bad for my health? Does it have endocrine disruptors? All of those things. And, we forget, like as consumers, that we actually have a lot of power in this world,
Mhm.
especially in a capitalistic society like the US.
Mhm.
So we need to think about how we can demand, better things. And groups like the EWG are really thinking about that.
Yeah, no, that's great. And a couple questions here. As healthcare plastic use expands and is burned, creating dioxin, causing more disease and creating more disease ad infinitum, are there alternatives to plastic in healthcare, glass autoclave, old school remedies or old
I
school
mean,
alternatives?
yeah, the issue is, I mean, we talk about this a lot because I also, as you mentioned in my little intro, I co-lead our kind of climate medical education and sustainable healthcare sort of at Stanford. I don't lead sustainable healthcare. There are people who are the healthcare experts in sustainability that lead that, but we're trying always to educate on how can we, green up our practices? How can we integrate climate medical education into all of the different, as a student or a faculty member moves through their training, like how can we know everything, how can we try and give them the information they need, and we're just finding that um, there's just it you try to green up a practice like the ORs, like take the ORs and waste reduction, right? I was just talking with urology yesterday, and it's like sometimes it doesn't seem like that. We need more research because sometimes, like, the disposable thing might be better in some cases because of all the, the washing and the this and the hauling, and there's just so many different things that go into it. I think the main thing to remember, and what we try and do this on the infectious disease side, is use less to start with, right? I think that's the simplest thing to start with. Do we really need all the PPE for, this, for precautions in this hospital, right? And we're starting to look at that, right? Because it was always an abundance of caution, like, oh no, we don't want to cause any infections in our patients, or we need to be safe, we need to be sterile, we need to do all this, but we went overboard, right? As we do. And so I think it's like ratcheting back and just like thinking. Like when I was talking to the urologist, he was like, yeah, we used to do all these cases. We never had a mask on. And now we wear masks. And I'm like, why do you wear the mask? So it's just like starting to think about these things and then ask the questions and then stop and just almost backtrack a little bit, right? I think there is a place for glass and for, autoclaving things. I work globally, right? So
Mhm.
Barb Ernie, who runs climate medical education with me, she was an ophthalmologist, and she always talks about how when she does surgeries in ophthalmology in the US, it takes this much waste, and that's how the exact amount of waste for 100 of the same operation in like India, right? And they have lower infection rates than we do. So I think, the idea that we need all of this stuff to keep our infection rates down, I don't think it's actually the truth. And I think we need to start to demand as a healthcare community some alternatives and more data and just, measuring things, trying it out and seeing, instead of
Mhm.
the evidence and the burden of evidence being on proving that it doesn't, hurt the patients. I think a lot of what we're doing is hurting our patients because we're using all this plastic and we're toxifying our
Right.
planet. So, yeah,
Right. And I think there is also healthcare without harm that helps with that. And they've got Practice Green Health, and also there is an
climate health
annual
now.
Clean Med conference. That's an annual Clean Med conference about the last 7 years, if people are
Absolutely.
interested in looking at that.
Yeah, there's
Um,
also PSNAP, which is like also
right,
about decreasing plastic waste in all the specialties as well.
right. And I think Emily will put that on. It's a wonderful group as well. So a couple more questions here. Is a lot actually, but doesn't recycling just recycle the toxins? That's a question.
Yeah, so it depends on the plasticizers and the toxins that are in there, if they actually, how you're doing the recycling and what type of recycling you're doing. There's sometimes there's chemical recycling, there's, pyrolysis, right, where you're actually
Mm,
burning
yeah.
things, and so different things break down in the different processes.
Mhm.
But that is a concern, right? Because again, when we say plastic, it's not just the polymer, it's not just the polyethylene or the PET, right? It's all
Mhm.
the plasticizers that are in there, and then what's happening. And most of the plastic, the number is that 9% of the world's plastic is recycled, but it's usually just once, right? It's not
Mhm.
forever
Yeah.
recyclable. And so what we really need to do is make a lot less plastic
Mhm.
and have
Start.
caps on that. Yeah.
Okay, and a couple more. Do the chemicals in plastics end up in the organisms we use for fertilizer or livestock?
Um, So there are studies happening right now. There's so much plastic in agriculture. In a couple of weeks, I'm actually going to give a talk about food and plastic.
Mm.
And there's just, I mean, much of the mulch is plastic. If you think about
Mm.
strawberry fields, they're covered in plastic, right?
Mhm.
So,
Right.
um, a lot of our soil ends up contaminated with plastic and the chemicals in plastic because of the agricultural practices that we choose to do,
Mhm.
right? And so yes, and
Okay.
there are again, we need to find alternatives for that. The issue is generally less, right? The reason why that's done is to have a higher yield, but actually you don't always get a higher yield, and then you get a lot more plastic in your food. And so, again, what are the alternatives? And as big business, big oil, big ag, are they willing to place humans and health over profit?
And they all profit from every time they sell more plastic. So, a question I want to get to before we end too is someone writes, I have several health issues. I work on both plastics and PFAS as a policy advocate. How do I get my doctors interested? Because they're generally unaware of these issues. And this might go back to PSNAP if you want to talk a little bit
Yeah,
about
I think, yeah.
psnap.org,
Yeah,
PSNAP.
peacenap.org. Yeah, I think it's wonderful that you are interested in that and that you're, and as you are integrated into the healthcare system, I would just continue to talk about things that I wouldn't get discouraged. I would, there are these resources. I mean, Emily has put so many in the chat. For the physicians, it could be that they just need to be educated. You come to them with your concerns, right? And if plastic and health and plastic impacts on health is one of your concerns, I mean, I inspire you and support you in, educating your physician. We don't always know everything, of course not, right? And we don't know a lot, and our patients are always teaching us things. So if this is another thing you want to teach your doctor, I would say go for it. And there are resources like Climate Health Now, like PSNAP, that resources for physicians to learn more about plastic. And I would continue to raise that because as a physician, right, we all do have egos and we want to be good doctors. And so when we hear like, oh my God, our patients are concerned about this and we don't know anything about that, most physicians will then take it upon themselves to do some education of themselves and their providers, their partners in their practice. So yeah,
That's
it's
fabulous.
them.
Fabulous. psnap.org. I want to thank you all for joining us tonight for this webinar. We're really grateful to Dr. LaBeaud for a fabulous talk and all this useful information to curtail our addiction to plastics and start using alternatives if we've not already started doing this already. Just a fantastic, wonderful talk, Dr. LaBeaud. I want to also thank our staff, Emily and Angelica, who work very hard behind the scenes to make all this happen and look so seamless. This program has been recorded and it will be posted on the SCCMA.org website under Environmental Health. And join us next Tuesday for our final webinar, Corporate Determinants of Health, and UCSF Internal Industry Document Library, and it will dovetail just very nicely with Dr. LaBeaud's talk. Good night, everyone. Have a nice evening. Thanks again.